From our 22 News Broadcast Center, this is 22 News in Focus.
Good Sunday afternoon. Welcome to 22 News in Focus. I'm Kate Walsh. 2016 is a big political year. There will be debates, the Iowa caucus, the primaries, and then November's election of the next president of the United States. And with that, other changes on the federal, state, and local levels of government. They'll make decisions about the economy, the war on terror, and they'll continue discussions over racism and gun control that were all reignited this past year in 2015. So today on 22 News in Focus, we have several guests who will give us insight into these topics and much more. First, joining me is your Congressman, Richard Neal. Thank you so much for being here, Congressman Neal.
Nice to be with you, Kate, and Happy New Year to you and your viewers.
Happy New Year. So first, let's talk about the culture in Congress right now. At the end of 2015, how was it with Paul Ryan taking over where John Boehner had stepped down?
Well, I don't think there were any substantive changes. There certainly were some changes in style, indicating that there would be more time, for example, to view controversial legislation. I'm not sure that adding 12 hours to the viewing period really made a big difference in what we accomplished. But at the same time, he had promised that to a renegade element in his own caucus. And it's known as the Freedom Caucus, and there are about 41 of them. And they're the ones that helped bring down John Boehner and did everything that they could to make Speaker Boehner's life difficult while he was Speaker. And then they allied themselves with Speaker Ryan. But in the end, it was really the same process that we had embraced under Speaker Boehner's leadership and under Speaker Pelosi's leadership that brought us to the goal line.
So now that he's Speaker of the House, not much has really changed?
Well, I don't think in the process of substance it changed much, but I think that there was a period of forgiveness that his own members gave him. His problem, and Speaker Boehner's problem, it really was with their own membership. The Democratic side, we were pretty much allied on common purpose, but the Republicans, they seem to be much more fractured. There seems to be the old country club Republicans are much in decline, and much of the strength of the modern Republican Party now comes in the South and the Southwest, and I think that they take a much more strident attitude toward what government can and cannot accomplish in their view.
So how does that all play into the presidential election coming up? The candidates, I'm sure there's talk about that on Capitol Hill. So how does that all play together?
Well, I think that the broader context of the debate really is the fact that there has been really very little economic growth for 12 years in America. I mean, I think that we can boast that there's been 70 straight months of growth, certainly 70 straight months of job creation. The unemployment rate went from 10% to recently published numbers at 5%, but not to miss the point, it's been a tepid recovery. And I think when you consider that the American people have really now not had a pay raise for the last 12 years of any substance, then I think it is demonstrated by the crowds that Donald Trump draws and the crowds that Bernie Sanders draw. It's people that are very frustrated in the logjam that is now their federal political system.
And this has happened throughout American history, similar type situations, but it seems like the candidates are unique this time around, right? We haven't had too many Donald Trump type candidates in years past.
Well, I remember George Wallace in my formative years, and I think that he spoke for Southeastern populism in America that had a strong racial tinge to it. But I also would recall that a third-party candidate named Ross Perot in '92, he had much to do with bringing about budget sensibility. I think he ran a campaign that was almost singularly based on the whole idea of getting the budget into balance, and I think he demonstrated with the use of his personal fortune that influence could be undertaken in a very serious manner. And it wasn't far after that that the presidential candidates all embraced essentially the same posture.
But do you think that Trump would be electable just like Ross Perot? You know, he didn't win. Is that the kind of thing?
I mean, I think that one of the things you always want to keep perspective on is that even though he's polling substantially within the Republican Party, some numbers have it between 28 and 34%. That still is about 7 to 10% of the total electorate. And I think that's the perspective that you want to keep as you begin to sort the numbers, which punditry certainly will embrace with great acceleration in coming weeks.
Absolutely, yeah. It seems like that's all they're talking about. It's the numbers each week. So.
Well, I mean, the arithmetic has changed. The metrics are much easier to measure today. And I also think there's a generational tug at what data means. And I think that in politics, the business has changed substantially from when I started, when it was really what we call the grin and the grip, in the sense that you were to give somebody a good firm handshake, look them in the eye and ask them for their vote. Today you want to know as much about them as you possibly can, and you want to know what it is that gets them to show up on Election Day.
Seems like social media plays a large part in that as well now, with people really making a connection with the candidates, right?
It does, but it also, I think, subtracts from the substantive part of the campaign, where you were one time were expected to get up and talk with some knowledge about really complicated issues. And I think it's summed up best as I think of myself as an individual who has great affection for the complete sentence and finishing a thought. And I think that amongst a younger generation of political figures, the tweet is more apparent.
It's effective, right?
Well, I also think that you could see the result of it in our election system now, where more and more emphasis is on entertainment as opposed to substantive accomplishment.
So looking forward to 2016, how do you see your role in Congress with all of the election campaigning going on at the same time? Will it change how you can actually work on
Well, the House
Hill?
of Representatives is 1/2 of 1/3 of the federal government, recalling that even though that the Senate is in play, you still need 60 votes to get anything done in the Senate. In the House, although Republicans have a decisive majority at this particular time, the presidential stakes are certainly apparent for everybody right now, and nobody knows what the outcome is going to be. We all have our suspicions as to how it's going to conclude and our favorites, but not to miss the point that, as I've heard repeatedly, that in the base of the Republican Party, they want a stronger, more aggressive challenge, they would argue, to President Obama. It leaves out the fact that he's going to be the president for the next 12 months. And in the Senate, again, you need 60 votes. So no matter what the House does, you still have to accommodate the Senate and the President of the United States, who may well hold differing views.
What do you think some of the big issues are going to be this year that the president will try to get through to try to, finish off his legacy strong?
The fundamental responsibility of any president and any federal government elected official is the security of the nation. Never to miss that point. So I think that there's going to be a great deal more emphasis on national security, given the events in Paris, given the events in San Bernardino. I think there's a greater danger of homegrown terrorism, the lone wolf operating. And also, you're going to see this continued debate over the role that immigration plays in America. And also, I think that there's going to be a pretty aggressive argument about the economy.
What is going on right now in the war on terror? What's being done to really make sure that something like Paris doesn't happen in the United States?
Well, I would hope that the Arab League, to begin with, would take a more assertive position. I think the Egyptians and the Saudi Arabians are obligated to take a greater role. While there's been good news recently in Iraq about advances that we've made with airstrikes, by the way, that I supported. And I think that that is at least an indication of some progress that we're making, but there's a greater stalemate in Afghanistan. The Taliban is reemerging. And I think greater uncertainty across the Arab world is going to have to be met by a stronger response from NATO and Europe in particular. But the American people, I don't believe, are really in the mood for sending troops back to Iraq or sending more troops to Afghanistan. So using airstrikes in America's air capacity and also the military advisors that we have is probably going to be the role that we continue to play. But not to miss the fact that I think that those who practice liberal democracy across Western Europe, the events in Paris, they've gotten everybody's attention, that's for sure.
Yeah. What's the price, our tax money that's going into these airstrikes? I'm sure it's adding up, right? All these airstrikes
Well,
are
it's very
costing
expensive. I don't think there's much question about that. But I think the horror that ISIS is demonstrating to the world, the random killings, what they've done to, I think, offer great harm to the innocent, has to be met with a strident response. And I think the airstrikes on America's part make sense. But we cannot do it alone. That's the point. So we're going to need help, as I've noted a few minutes ago, from our allies across the globe, including, strategically, the Russians in Syria.
What's that going to be like in the next year? Do you think that there's going to be more conflict between Russia and the U.S.? It seems like we're not really on the same page when it comes to who's supporting who in Syria.
I think the Russians have to be mindful of the threat that is offered by some of their former republics, and some that have not formally broken away but wish great harm to Russia. And I think that in the end, realpolitik is going to be what prevails. And I think it's common purpose that brings people together of differing views. But I think that in some measure, Putin is going to be required to offer some assistance in stabilizing Syria before we can move forward with a plan to decimate ISIS.
And we'll continue that conversation in just a few minutes with Congressman Richard Neal after a short break. Stay with us. You're watching 22 News in Focus. Welcome back to 22 News in Focus. Today we're talking politics, what happened in 2015 and what we can expect in 2016. So we're continuing our conversation now with Congressman Richard Neal, and we're going to switch gears a little bit to some local issues, the issues that your constituents really care about and that you represent them in Washington and talk about with them when you come visit here and see what's going on. So let's talk about Union Station. That's something that you've been very passionate about for decades.
It's a great landmark. It's an extraordinary landmark. It's almost 90 years old. It was closed in 1973, and I announced my candidacy for the Springfield City Council from there in 1977. I think it was May 6th of 1977, and it had been closed for a period of time then. The Springfield newspaper actually did a story on the last train visit there at the time to the old Union Station, and I really vowed that I was going to get it brought back to life. It's an extraordinary landmark, and Union stations across the country are surely being brought back to life. And I think that there are those communities that regret very much the demolition that took place. So I vowed not to let the building be demolished. Was part of a land taking to secure the building, and have always had more than enough federal money to make sure that Union Station was completed. So there, as part of the stimulus package that we passed a few years back, John Olver and I were able to convince Deval Patrick to work on rail north-south. And there are more trains, there are going to be more trains, and Governor Malloy in Connecticut, as you know, he's made a major commitment to rail transportation. So what Governor Malloy has done is to proceed with improving that track from New Haven to Hartford, and on the Springfield side, headed north, we've done a pretty good job with it as well. Now I'd like to emphasize east-west, but not to miss the point that Union Station, I hope, is going to be bustling again in the not-too-distant future. It should be completed by the end of 2016.
That's right. Why do you think rail travel is becoming more popular?
Well, I think that there's greater efficiencies, and on the Northeast Corridor, it is heavily traversed, much used. There are other parts of the country where the subsidy really keeps it going, but not to miss the point that it's energy efficient, and that there are more people that are comfortable taking it, and not to, again, I think, tread too easily on it, but it's a pretty convenient way to travel.
Fairly safe, would you say?
Yeah, I think it's safe. I use it from time to time to head to New York, or I use it from time to time if I have an event where I have to come up from Washington, and I take full advantage of it.
Oil prices are pretty low right now. People are taking advantage of that, you know, filling their gas in their car, and it's a lot cheaper to fill a tank than it was just a year ago. Why are the oil prices so low compared to how they were just a year ago?
Well, the Saudis, to begin with, they've decided that they're going to try to stretch price in the marketplace. So they are not going to cut back on production. And what's happened is there is now a glut of oil, a glut of natural gas across the globe. And if I had said to you 4 or 5 years ago that you and I would be talking in 2016 and we'd be discussing oil at $36 a barrel,
Couldn't believe it.
there would have been disbelief.
That's right.
So I think that that's part of it, but also not to miss the point that that now has presented its own problems because all of those capacity undertakings and the efforts and investments that were made, you can't make profit at $36 a barrel.
Right.
So as pleased as we all are, and delighted as we all are, that gasoline is under $2 a gallon here across western Massachusetts, not to miss the point that it brings another set of problems along. But this is going to be a good home heating season for people in New England.
Is this something that you see will continue?
Oh, I think it's going to continue for the next couple of years.
Okay.
I don't think there's much doubt about that. The shale undertakings in America alone have changed the marketplace, and I think that the production capacity of the Saudis in particular, and what's happened again across much of Europe, has made energy independence much more palatable.
So let's talk about the economy. In 2015, last year, you were a key player in passing the New Markets Tax Credit Extension Act. Can you explain what that is?
It's almost for me like Union Station. I mean, I've been at that forever as well. New markets, I think, are a very handsome tool that you can use in urban areas and in moderate to low income areas for enhancing old properties and bringing investment. We have a number of examples here across western Massachusetts, and I have in fact been the national leader, certainly the lead Democrat in the House of Representatives on new markets, tax credits, and in the tax bill that we did at the conclusion of 2015, which I must tell you was an acceptable compromise, that we were able to extend new markets for 5 years, make the R&D tax credit permanent, make the earned income tax credit permanent, enhance the savers credit, and also to make the child credit permanent. Those are pretty, I think, good accomplishments by any standard.
Why do you think it was something that passed with a lot of compromise compared to other bills that might have taken a lot longer to do?
Well, I disagree vehemently with the tax cuts in 201 and 203 that President Bush offered, and they really overwhelmingly went to people at the very top. The marginal rates, when you examine what happened and who paid what, you can see clearly that those gains went to the people at the very top. And now, you can see that just a couple of years ago, we were able to change some of that to make it, I think, more equitable. But I think the compromise really was that the Republicans wanted some issues maintained and Democrats wanted some issues maintained, and then you had to get it over to the Senate to get some votes. And what we were able to do was a binary process at the end, where the House actually voted on 2 bills, but the Senate combined them and voted on 1 bill.
Okay.
And President Obama said early on he was going to sign the bill. So that gave Democrats an incentive to buy in, and at the same time there were issues that the Republicans wanted, including lifting the export ban on oil, which is a big deal for them. And the only way they were going to get that was acceding to some of the wishes that we had on some of the issues I've just outlined. And in the end, Kate, that's acceptable as a promise of compromise.
Do you find that there's going to be more compromise among Congress members next year this year in 2016? Ever
the optimist, I'd like to think it, but I think that the presidential election cycle will make that a bit more complicated. And you're going to get, I think, a much more focused position on where the candidates are after Iowa. The process really accelerates after Iowa. You go to February 9th for New Hampshire, after February 1st in Iowa, and then it's on to South Carolina, and then it's on to Super Tuesday. You are likely to know on the Democratic side by Super Tuesday who the nominee is going to be. And on the Republican side, I think that field is going to quickly go from what originally was 20, probably down to 6 or 7.
Do you want to give us your guesses as to who you think the final 2 will be come November?
Well, I always think being a prognosticator is not the best purpose that I serve, but I think by way of disclosure, it's important for me to acknowledge that I've been a long-time Clinton supporter.
Right.
And at the same time, I think there's still room for Rubio and Cruz on the Republican side. I think the story of this campaign year on the Republican side is why, at the moment anyway, Jeb Bush did not catch on.
Okay.
If you remember 6 months ago, he was the odds-on favorite. He raised more than $103 million for his super PAC. He continues to poll at 6th or 7th in this race. It really is the story of the election year.
It's an interesting
on the Republican
year.
side. But they're always interesting. I mean, it's this. The other thing is, I always point out, as one who's been much involved in these campaigns over many, many years, when Jack Kennedy ran for president, I believe he ran in 6 primaries in 1960. When Teddy Kennedy ran for president in 1980, he ran in 40. I mean, there's a primary now every week. And so the winner, unfortunately, is now the survivor.
Will you be going to any of the primaries?
I'm going to be in New Hampshire.
New Hampshire, okay.
I sure will.
Supporting Hillary?
Supporting Hillary.
All right. Thank you very much, Congressman Richard Neal. It's an exciting year ahead, and a lot is going to change for sure once we have a new president, and before that, with everyone trying to get everything done in Congress before that happens. So after the break, we'll get insight into these issues that are impacting people around the world from a former ambassador to the Middle East. You're watching 22 News in Focus. You're watching 22 News in Focus. Today we're talking politics and other issues that we'll be facing in 2016. The world is debating climate change and how to prevent terrorist attacks. So our next guest has made his life's work in both of these issues, really. So joining me now is former United States Ambassador Mark Hambley. Thank you so much for being here today, Mark.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Before we get into the issues, first give us some background as to what you've done as ambassador.
Well, I was ambassador starting in 1999 in Qatar. this little country in the Persian Gulf. And at the time, we had the first military deployment during the Gulf War, which changed our whole relationship with that small country. And then we brought in natural gas, brought Mobil, and that became ExxonMobil, which developed natural gas, making it the richest country in the world and the fourth largest producer of natural gas in the world. And so we have a good relationship with Qatar. And then I moved on into climate change for 5 years and worked on that through the Kyoto process. So it's very nice to see what's going on now, given Paris, et cetera.
Wow, yeah, you have a great perspective, I'm sure, and insight as to everything going on in the world right now. You're also part of Next Century Foundation. Can you talk about that?
Next Century Foundation was founded a number of years ago. I've been associated since I left the government in 2005. And it's a foundation which is, since the Arab Spring, so-called, started in 2011, it's been focused on the four freedoms of Franklin Roosevelt: freedom from fear, freedom from want, freedom of religion, and freedom of expression, and the importance of bringing human dignity into areas of crisis and conflict. So we've been in several countries, in Iraq, in Syria, in Egypt, Libya, and in Yemen, trying to find ways in which we can bring divisive parties together in a more positive manner to try and protect those who are suffering from some of these conflicts.
Very interesting.
So,
in Syria right now, can you give us some insight as to what's going on there? I mean, they've been in civil war for what,
5 years?
5 years now.
5 years. Well, Syria is a major catastrophe, and I'm afraid that it will continue to be a problem for the next several years. Since the revolution started, the civil war started in 2011, there have been over 250,000 people have died. It's kind of only 21 million people, but one half of that, about 11 million, are now either refugees overseas or internally displaced. About 5 million of those are overseas in Lebanon, in Turkey, in Jordan, in northern Iraq, and 1 million, of course, have made their way into Europe as well. So that's one of the leading factors the past year. But I'd say in last year, in 2015, there were really a number of factors which have made the situation in Syria a little more clarified. The first was the intervention of the Russians in September. That, I think, forced the international community to find a way in which we can get together to try and find a political solution to the problem. The Russians are there large because there are some 2,900 Russian civilians working with ISIS, the terror group which is targeting not only the Middle East but other places in the world, Paris, U.S., Russia as well.
The Russians are working with ISIS?
No, they're against ISIS.
Yes.
Because there are so many Russian citizens that are involved, they want to make sure they do not become a threat, backlash, and move to Russia to create problems. In fact, last month there was an incident in Dagestan created by ISIS as well. So ISIS is very much on the move in Russia as well as in Europe. Secondly, there was the issue of trying to find a way in which we have a political solution. There was an important vote in the UN Security Council December 18, largely due to the efforts of Secretary Kerry and Foreign Minister Lavrov of Russia, which brought together for the first time the consensus in the Security Council, a unanimous decision, 15-0, that there must be a political solution to Syria. This has been twice vetoed by the Russians in the past and the Chinese as well. But this time all countries came to regard situations being such that we have to have a political process to try and find a way to resolve the issue. This will not be easy. It's based on Geneva, the Geneva talks of 2012. There's supposed to be a political process starting in Geneva next month, bringing opposition and government people together to talk. The difficulty is, while the government has identified individuals to be part of the delegation, the opposition still has a long way to go, I think, in terms of finding a group willing to find a result which will bring forward a peaceful settlement. One reason being that the most effective forces fighting in Syria today are the Islamic State and something called Ahrar al-Sham and Nusra Front. Nusra Front is al-Qaeda.
Okay.
Largely non-Syrian fighters, some Syrians, but large number of non-Syrian fighters. ISIS, the bulk of ISIS, 20,000, 30,000 men, are largely people from overseas, not Syrians. But these are the most effective forces fighting in Syria, and they have to somehow be brought into the process. We can eliminate them. They will not be part of any negotiated settlement.
So did the civil war kind of bring up these terrorist cells in Syria, you know, a time of trouble? It's a good opportunity for them to really try to take control? Or have they always been there? And why are they becoming more powerful now in Syria?
Well, I think certainly the Muslim Brothers were very strong in Syria. While they're not branded as a terrorist group, they certainly have sponsored a lot of terrorist groups in the past. And they were very strong in Syria and prompted an earlier civil war in the late 1970s, early 1980s, where Hafez al-Assad really clamped down on them. A famous incident where he massacred several thousand of them in Hamas in Hama, the city of Hama at one point. But then they sort of were down in the mosque, laying low. The revolution started because of civil rights disputes with the Syrian government, problems over economic disparities, over lack of opportunity. What's going on in the rest of the Middle East? People wanted to have a solution, and unfortunately, Hafez al-Assad decided to crack down on that. There were some folks who started to stir up animosity between the Alawite community, which is a large minority, which happens to Hafez al-Assad happens to be a member. Bashar al-Assad is a member of that community. So there should be sectarian fights which broke out, and then this wonderful mosaic, which was Syria, made up of Christians, Alawites, Sunni Muslims, Shia Muslims, Druze, Ismailis, and Kurds as well.
Getting along before.
Yeah, getting along before suddenly became very much of a conflagration. You had groups then starting with the ISIS group started to come in and took advantage of the turmoil and started to promulgate the type of terror which has become civil war today in Syria.
So how optimistic are you that these talks in the next few months will be successful, or at least make some progress in ending the civil war?
No, they will not be successful. But I think the important issue is you get people talking. And if you have the united powers of the world focused on making progress, there may be, what we want to do in Syria is to impose ceasefires and get humanitarian aid in as a first step. And if that is all these talks going to accomplish, and that indeed is a big step forward. To have a solution will be several years down the line, I'm afraid.
And even after that, it seems like it would be decades before people can really return to their homes and find
Syria,
some normalcy.
if you look at pictures of the great city of Aleppo, which is a large city in Damascus, a very historic city, it's been massively destroyed. All the city is massively destroyed. The only city where there's being some reconstruction now is in the city of Homs, which is about the fourth largest city in the country, coming and starting to rebuild, BAM's starting to come back. But the diaspora outside, it'll be very difficult for many of them to come back, I think. We'll have to have a really concerted effort worldwide trying to reunite people, bring them into Syria.
So in the meantime, all these people are moving out, as you said, 1 million now in Europe. Many thousands are dying on boats trying to get somewhere. Yes. What is your position, knowing how things work in the world like you do, what is your position, in your opinion, on accepting these people here in the United States?
Well, we're a country of immigrants. You know, I think Statue of Liberty says it very well. You know, bring me you're homeless, you're tired, you're hungry. We're a country based on immigrants, and I think that we should be welcoming. I think the fear mongers who have stirred up these people are terrorists are being very inaccurate. Certainly, we have to watch out for people coming in to do nefarious deeds. But I think many of those who have conducted these terrorist incidents here in the past have been resident citizens here for a number of years. The gentleman who did the killings in Chattanooga, Tennessee, was American-born. Amr al-Awlaki, the leading al-Qaeda operative who was killed by a drone in Yemen, but a leading promulgator of terrorist thought in the U.S. among young people, was American-born. So I think that it's a matter of we should be welcoming to people. We should find ways to give them jobs, educations. If you see someone in a grocery store that's a bit different, give them a welcome. The other day I was at one of our Big Y and saw 2 Iraqis, and they were just got an Arabic sign. I said, well, you know, welcome to the United States. They just beamed. They were so happy to know that someone was acknowledging them, that they were welcome. And I think in 2016, I think it'd be very useful if we took a good attitude, because all of us are immigrants.
But there is the fear as well, you know, of terrorism across Europe. They've been accepting people for years. Then there's these terrorist attacks that happen. So is there some kind of balance there?
Well, there is, but the U.S. is a little bit different than Europe. We have had for our entire history have been welcoming groups in. We've had terrorist groups in the past, didn't call them that, but various groups which have been operating, which we had to have good law enforcement take care of. I think as long as we have the Homeland Security, the FBI, and our local police departments on alert, as they are already, we've learned a lot of lessons in the past. As Congressman Neal said in the preceding segment, there are lone wolves that will do bad things here. We have to hope that we can't really prevent all those, but I think we can prevent another 9/11 because we're a lot more concerned about what's going on. Remember, they always strike places we least expect. So, I mean, train security is something we have to really work on a little more, I think. We have to worry about our schools, make sure the schools are tight, because these people will strike anywhere where it causes pain.
And no matter what we do with trying to accept these refugees in, that probably won't have anything to do with the low
I think that's quite irrelevant. I think the The refugee program, again, people are screened very carefully to come to the U.S., and they're not let in unless they have a clearance. And that's one of the problems, one of the issues with the United Nations, that we clear people too intensively, they say. But I think we have to keep doing that. But once they're viewed as being legitimate refugees, asylum seekers, or economic refugees here in the country, we should let them in and welcome them and get them trained, Americanize them.
All right, Mark Hamley, thank you so much for being here and talking to us, giving your insight on all of these issues that are important to us this coming year.
And Happy New Year to you, Kate.
Thank you, you too. 2015 was a busy year for local politics, so after the break, we'll be discussing regional issues with a political consultant. You're watching 22 News in Focus. Welcome back to 22 News in Focus. Today we're discussing local and world events from 2015 and what to look forward to in 2016. We've heard from your Congressman Richard Neal and a former U.S. ambassador about national and international issues. And joining me now to talk about state and local and national issues is political consultant Tony Signoli. So thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thanks, Kate.
We'll start on the local issue. The November elections that recently passed us. The mayoral races, it seemed like voter turnout was pretty low this time around. So why is that? What kind of factors energize people to get out to the polls? Because it's not convenient to go to vote, you know?
You know, when you look at all the mayoral races, some of them are hotly contested, Holyoke and Chicopee, and usually when it's a hot contest, that will bring more people out. If we look, we can see that the electorate turned out a little bit more in those communities than it normally does, but not by the numbers that you would think. It always kills me, having done elections in other countries and other places, to see places like Peru, where folks will turn out 95% of the electorate, will turn out time and time over again until they elect a president, for example, until they get a majority. And to see us have to scrape here to try to get people to come out. So what does bring people out? Unfortunately, anything that's sensational, a scandal, something, a real anger at an incumbent mayor or a real anger at a candidate. Unfortunately, that seems to be the thing that generates more interest than anything else. But even there, as we look around the country, when there are big issues like that, or scandals or whatever, that's just not enough to really get up there into the kinds of numbers that we should be getting. To see a 60% or a 70%, we just would be overjoyed.
So what would be a realistic good number? 60 seems kind of high.
It's far-fetched today. It shouldn't be and whatnot. But we get excited when we see 40% right now, and that's really unfortunate. Because what happens then is that it means that just the political players, the insiders, we're the ones that get to call the shots on an election, and that's wrong. It's hijacking the system. It's hijacking the process. And you know, you hear so many folks complain all the time about what government's doing or how their taxes are being spent. This is that one moment a year. It takes so little time. It's so easy to vote. And you don't even have to go to vote if you don't want to. You can go to City Hall anytime ahead of time, or you can get an absentee ballot and do it from the comfort of your home. But it's just so darn easy to do. And it's just so unfortunate more people don't realize that by not doing it, you're leaving the process to the insiders and the players.
Do you think that people believe their vote just doesn't matter?
That is the largest thing. When we poll and we ask people, you know, always we're polling registered voters who are likely to vote, or what we like to call purge voters, folks that voted in 3 out of the last 4 elections or the last 4. We sometimes now look for new universes of voters. How can I find a new group of folks who are registered to vote but haven't shown up in the last couple of years or show up infrequently? We're asking them those kinds of questions right now. And you just hit it. The number one thing, it doesn't matter, it doesn't count, it's just my one vote. And they're so wrong in that overall. Unfortunately, that's the mindset. I can't fight City Hall. I can't make a difference. Washington is so broken. Why am I going to take an hour to go and vote? And we've got to find some way to address that and make people realize this is their government and this is the way that they have a say, the only way that they have a say.
So are there any ways to do that, to make them feel?
There comes a time when folks get angry as heck, or as the movie Network, you know, famously said, mad as hell. And you're seeing some tap into that right now. You're seeing it with the folks supporting Bernie Sanders, and you're seeing it with the folks supporting Donald Trump. As we rip into some significant polls across the country and ask people why they're supporting one or the other, you'll find some principled players that will say that they agree with Trump on this or Bernie on that. But the other part of it, I'm mad. I'm really angry, and I'm coming out to support one or the other because Washington's broken, and I want to make a major statement. So are there ways for that to happen? Certainly. There's populist movements that come along. They can be local movements and whatnot. I can think of many of them here in Pioneer Valley over the course of the years where a local issue drove people to polls, where they were angry about something. And usually that's what it takes. And then also, it takes good candidates and campaigns that know how to connect with the electorate to make that case, to fire folks up. The opportunities are still there, and we do see it with a lot of the elected officials in Western Massachusetts, where they have strong followings and a strong base that will come out for them. There's just got to find some way to get the folks who are the infrequent voters to agree with them and get out there and vote one way or another way when it comes time.
So what kind of issues do you see will be those hot button topics on the local level for future races? We've been hearing a lot lately about recreational marijuana becoming legalized. Do you think that would be something that would get people out? Is that something they'd be passionate about?
I think so, depending on how exercised or energized the campaigns for and against are. This one is starting to line up in a unique way. You've got the mayor of Boston with a passionate argument against marijuana being legalized. You've got the liberal progressive attorney general of Massachusetts saying no, and you've got the governor of Massachusetts, a Republican, saying no. So you've got a unique coalition coming together against legalization. But what they're going to be up against is that thought and that permissive, liberal, progressive thought that's basically there in Massachusetts that, gosh, golly gee whiz, who cares? This one could get hot because there's a passion beyond this, too. Folks who want it legalized are passionate. And don't be surprised if a lot of money comes in on the legalized side, not just from Massachusetts residents or supporters, but even from outside as well. This is big business. So, yes, this could fire it up. That's the background of that particular issue. But watch how the spin doctors, how the political consultants formulate it on one side of that to try to fire up the electorate to get them to come out. My gosh, this is either reefer madness or it could be the greatest thing in the world. You'll see some unique commercials on this before all is said and done.
If it does go on the ballot.
Yes, exactly.
Also, next year, Sheriff Michael Ash is retiring.
Wow.
Hampden
Yes.
County, 40
Big.
years as
Big.
sheriff, I believe. So what do you see as that being, in the next election season? What kind of candidates do you see running for that, and who will be qualified for that?
Well, it's a stunner on this particular one that after 42 years, Mike Ash announced almost 2 years ahead of time that he would not be running. That's somewhat exemplary. Usually elected officials, folks in government try to hang on to their power as long as they can. He telecasted out there long in advance, and if you look at his announcement as to why he made it when he did, he said, listen, this is way too important of a seat for this just to be a political game, that this just would be a politician or political decision made here. You've got to have someone that's qualified to do this. The Hampden County Sheriff's Department is somewhat unique. It's nationally recognized for its programs that return people back to the community. Mike Ash saves taxpayers a ton of money by getting folks through the process, through the system, getting them back into society so they're not, quote unquote, on the taxpayer's dime, so to speak. They're not, the cost of incarceration, I believe, is about $40,000 to $44,000 a year, just the base to start for an individual. So there's that aspect of this. It is a budget that's in the multi-million, 70+ million off the top of my head, 1,000 employees. But the bigger piece of it, as we face this opioid crisis right now, whether you hear it from District Attorney Gallooni, whether you hear it from Sheriff Michael Ash, or others in the Commonwealth, even Charlie Baker, a lot are looking at this Sheriff's Department as an example of how you address opioids, how you fix this, how you address before it becomes the larger problem with individuals who need programs and help. This is a big deal. The other part of it, the politics. Arguably, the two most powerful politicians, elected officials in Western Massachusetts, are Mike Ash and Congressman Neal. Both men command large armies and large loyalties of people. We've polled over the past maybe decade plus. We always put Mike Ash's name in a poll because it's a bellwether for us. We know from one poll to the next that if there isn't a great variation, on his numbers, that the poll is a solid one. This man polls in the 80 percentile of favorability. That's impossible, and yet he gets those kinds of numbers. This is a big deal. So who to look for that particular seat? You're going to be looking for someone who's got professional correctional background, who's got a law enforcement background. I need to recuse myself, as Congressman Neal did earlier, relative to Hillary Clinton. I'm supporting Nick Kochi. We're involved in his campaign. Here's somebody with 22 years background in the Hamden County Sheriff's Department. But certainly, there's going to be a lot of people, I think, running for this one before all is said and done, because it is such a major, major, major seat that has such a huge bearing on not just Hamden County, but Western Massachusetts. Mike Ash wrote a whole brand new book as the sheriff of Hamden County.
Very interesting year ahead of us,
yes,
for sure. Tony Signoli will be right back. We'll continue our conversation and talk about the national scene, especially with the presidential election coming up later this year. You're watching 22 News in Focus. You're watching 22 News in Focus. Today we've been talking about politics and the major issues of 2015 and what to look for in 2016. So we're continuing our conversation now with political consultant Tony Signoli, and we're talking about the presidential election in this year. It's already heated up a lot in 2015. Lots of candidates in the race, especially on the Republican side. Let's first talk about Donald Trump. You've called him an anomaly. He's someone that's a unique person, whether you like him, whether you don't. He's someone people are talking about. What is that factor he has that makes him not likable per se, but someone that people want to hear what he's saying?
Well, it's intriguing. It's a confluence of different things right now. An electorate that is awfully angry, that believes that Washington is broke and that believe they've got to do something to shake it up. It is his celebrity on top of all that, his bombasticness, as he himself would say. We've never seen anything like this. He's either an anomaly or a political presidential phenomenon. You know, every pundit, every consultant said 8 months ago, 5 months ago, 3 months ago, he's done, it's over, after this gaffe or that attack or whatever. When he attacked John McCain, I thought it was over at that point. I have never represented a political candidate for anything who could have survived saying something like that about a fellow like John McCain. Whether you like McCain or don't like McCain, wow, what Trump had to say. But it's stunning what's going on with Donald Trump. When we poll and we ask about him, or we look at the polls of grand and great pollsters, whether it be Quinnipiac, Suffolk, gosh, even Franklin Pierce looking at New Hampshire right now, we've seen something amazing happen from August to now. We had people in August saying that I don't like Donald Trump, I don't think he can be the nominee, but I'm going to vote for him. Those numbers have now changed. His likability factor has more than tripled, which is stunning in New Hampshire. And there are people now believing he could be the nominee. Then we ask a fourth question, Kate. We get into, well, why? If you don't like him or you don't think he could be the nominee, why? And it comes back to just because. I'm angry, I'm mad, and I'm going to throw it to Trump. I don't want the same old, same old. I don't want one of these governors. Congressman Neal said it earlier in the show. One of the big stories, as much as we talk about this being the year of Donald Trump, this is the year of not being Jeb Bush. This is stunning. 100 million plus, and no traction at all for Jeb Bush, at least to this point. Who knows what happens February 1st, February 9th, or as they get on down to South Carolina after that. But it is a stunning thing. February 1st is important because it's a caucus in Iowa. That's a whole different ballgame. Can Donald Trump now take all this popularity, this noise, these gigantic crowds larger than we've seen before for a presidential candidate, at least in modern history, and can he transfer that into people that need to now go to the caucus, who his campaign can explain to them, how do you caucus, what do you do? You've got to actually load buses with people and get them to the right caucus and get them to actually go through this process. Will his people do that? Even if he comes in second, there's a victory in that for him. For a novice, for a newcomer, there's a victory. If New Hampshire becomes his, and it looks that way right now, that's grand. And then can he translate that into South Carolina? Talking to folks from South Carolina this week, some of them on air with us in Boston radio and just others who are friends, on both sides, Democrats and Republicans, they are telling me that Trump is actually now hiring or bringing people to the table who know how to get out the vote. He's taking this seriously now. This isn't a joke.
But a lot of people are afraid that if he were to become president, that bombastic personality that he says he has might be, something that the rest of the world will view negatively, like the UK has kind of said they have. So do you see Congress and other parts of the federal government being kind of the checks and balances here if he were to become president that would even that out, or would that be something those people should be fearful of?
That's a unique thing too. Some folks, not so much political consultants, but folks smarter than myself, political scientists, academics, others, folks who have been in government for a long time, the think tank folks, on both sides, conservative and liberal, you know, if all the ifs were to happen, and it's awfully hard for all the ifs to happen for Donald Trump to become president, there is this wild thought that Congress, the House and the Senate, that all branches of government have got to step up exactly to do what you just said, checks and balances. It puts everybody on their A game. I think that long before that becomes the case, the real litmus test for Donald Trump, should he be the Republican nominee, going up against the Democratic nominee, will be something that actually Hillary Clinton did in 2008, where she tried to portray Barack Obama as non-presidential. Remember those ads? What happens at 2 o'clock in the morning when the phone rings? And I think that's a perception or a photograph, a picture that'll be painted of Donald Trump, not even just so much by the Democrats, but by those Republicans who will try to stop him from becoming the nominee. What happens at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning when something happens in the Middle East and you can't call Ambassador Mark Hambley for help? What happens when you're going to knock on the door of the presidential bedroom and say, come on down to the Situation Room? I think that that will be one of the overwhelming factors now for Trump to deal with. It's not just domestic or the issues that seem to have worked for him at this point, you know, immigration. It's that bigger piece. We're voting for the chief executive of the United States, the person who sits behind the big desk with the red phone there, you know, who's going to make that call to Putin or push that button. That starts to change things. He's got to change as a candidate to be able to meet that standard and that litmus test of the voters who will show up in a general election.
So what about on the Democratic side? We talked about Hillary Clinton just briefly. Do you think that she, hands down, will be the candidate, or does Bernie Sanders have a chance, Martin O'Malley, anyone else coming?
Well, certainly Bernie Sanders is surprising us by the amount of money he's able to continue to raise. This last quarter has been phenomenal for him, numbers that no one expected him to be able to get. We've seen this before. If those folks, however, don't have Bernie Sanders as their nominee, not all will stay the course with Hillary Clinton, but the majority will against the Republican nominee. What we see in every state is that Hillary's organization is superior everywhere, except in New Hampshire, where Bernie Sanders benefits by being the United States Senator from Vermont, and he has a huge army in New Hampshire. But as you start to get into the other states, you know, where it comes down to that voter identification, getting folks out to vote, it's Hillary Clinton who's got the much larger organization. And not just the paid organization, but volunteers. Certainly there's a lot of passion there for Bernie Sanders. And I think we may have mentioned this before here. A kingmaker or a queenmaker still is Elizabeth Warren. As she endorses, as she goes, a large base of that Bernie group will go as well. If she comes out for Hillary Clinton and makes the case for Hillary Clinton, Elizabeth Warren's reach is way beyond Massachusetts now. She's hot in a whole bunch of other states, and she can move that part of the electorate that Sanders has locked up right now to Clinton if that's the way that she goes.
It seems like Massachusetts always votes blue, always Democrat. But we also vote Republican senator. We've voted Republican governor.
We like Republican governors in this Democratic state.
So what do you think we'll see this year when it comes to president?
It'll be blue. It'll be Democratic, you know, when it comes time for the general. But right now, what we know from the most recent polls, from real stalwart pollsters, and certainly they're not Trump's pollsters, because he's not paying for any pollsters, which is also stunning to all of us. And he's flying this thing without, you know, the political GPS, without the political gauges and radar and sonar that you need to fly something this large. But what we're seeing is that clearly Trump wins Massachusetts right now. And it's stunning to me because it's statewide. It's from the Cape and Islands to the Berkshires. He's got this kind of base of support. And of course here, we're not a caucus state. You just get to show up and vote on primary day in Massachusetts. Right now he rules that roost. And that's why we're seeing so little from the other Republican candidates right now in Massachusetts. Hillary has got great numbers in Massachusetts, but certainly Bernie Sanders is going to make a stand here. And his Massachusetts campaign person is a former player for Ted Kennedy and John Kerry. This guy, Tad Devine, knows the state, and I think that Bernie will try to make a stand here, without a doubt. It's 121 delegates at stake.
Interesting year ahead for sure. Thank you so much, Tony Signoli,
Absolutely.
for being on with us today. Stay with us. You're watching 22 News in Focus. That's our program for today. If you missed any of this or you want to watch it again, remember we have everything from InFocus on our website, wwlp.com. Have a great Sunday.